It all started when Harold Squarepants and Margaret Squarepants met a long time ago, fell in love, and this is how you imagine the origin story of SpongeBob SquarePants, right? But the truth is, it's much bigger and more complex than you think. The story of SpongeBob's world begins long before his mother, Margaret Squarepants, became pregnant with him. Millions of years ago, when life was still evolving and dinosaurs roamed the planet's surface, life beneath the water was also slowly developing, with some prehistoric animals already in existence, but with a complete absence of intelligence. And it was like that for a very long time, until the first intelligent life reached the depths of the sea. That's right, reached, because originally they weren't from there. This happened 25,000 years ago. Yes, you heard that right, 25 millennia ago. The Atlantean people, highly developed beings with advanced intellects, so much so that their brains are exposed. After traveling through their home planet's galaxy for billions of light years and arriving on Earth, they settled at the bottom of the sea, where they found a favorable environment for their way of life and founded the city of Atlantis.
Welcome to Atlantis. I've been expecting you.
After building their city, they colonized the entire ocean floor and brought with them the first living bubble in history, which is over 1 million years old and would become their most precious relic of all.
Look at it, Patrick. So ancient. So floaty. It is the most beautiful, wrinkled-up, dusty old bubble I've ever seen.
While the Atlantean people, due to their advanced intelligence, lived in a highly technological city, beings outside that environment evolved slowly, as we can see in the episode where Squidward travels back 9,000 years in a time machine to find peace to play his clarinet. In other words, it had already been 16,000 years since the Atlantean people had colonized and lived at the bottom of the sea. But the other inhabitants of the deep sea were still underdeveloped and lacked intelligence, like the ancestors of SpongeBob and Patrick. A few years later, we can see that the ancestors of SpongeBob, Patrick, and now also Squidward had developed a bit more. They had managed to build their own houses, and surprisingly, they were neighbors. We can also see that they already had instruments and knew how to use fire, and they even knew how to hunt algae, as shown in the drawings on the walls of SpongeBob's house. Moving forward in time, around 5,000 years ago, Neptune was born, the ruler of the deep seas, who is both the king and the god of the ocean inhabitants. Sometime later, about 2,000 years ago, Neptune imprisons his own son Triton in a cage to teach him good manners and how to be a true god and king, just because the boy liked the mortal world and wanted to learn how to play baseball.
I'm sealing you inside this magical shrinking cage until you learn to embrace your destiny.
Or like when he found the cure for all mortal diseases, which was reason enough for him to initially cage the boy for 10,000 years. However, 200 years later, the kingdom of Atlantis, ruled by King Neptune, disappeared into the depths of the sea. But King Neptune's family still has their castle and their servants who obey out of fear that Neptune imposes upon them. Advancing through the centuries, about 1,500 years ago, we arrive at the medieval version of Bikini Bottom and one of the most significant moments in the entire SpongeBob SquarePants history. The medieval village of the Rift was always under attack by a cruel and terrible being, the ancestor of SpongeBob's main antagonist, Plankton. And surprisingly, the name of the villain and sorcerer from the past was Planktonomus. He ends up being defeated by SpongeBob and Patrick in the end, with the help of the medieval version of Sandy.
Curses! You win.
Furthermore, this would essentially be the first time the first Krabby Patty would be made, thus originating the most delicious snack in the deep sea. Continuing with the passage of time, approximately 1,200 years later, Patrick's great-great-great-great-uncle, Patrick Revere, rode through the streets of what would one day become Bikini Bottom, warning about the hungry man-eating mollusks. However, nobody listened to him, but his time doesn't stand still. Around 100 years after Patrick's ancestor was considered a madman, we meet the Wild West version of Bikini Bottom and the fearless ancestor of SpongeBob named Buck Squarepants. According to history books, he saved the entire village of Bikini Bottom, which was known at the time as Deadeye Gulch. The villain tormenting everyone was simply Deadeye, another plankton ancestor who was skilled with a whip and knew how to be very malicious. Shortly after that era, in the early 1900s, the most famous superhero duo in the entire underwater world emerged: Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, who would always be ready to defend Bikini Bottom when needed. It all began when a surfer was sucked into the sea and saved by mermaids, hence his name, who gave him a special star that allowed him to breathe underwater, and they continue to do so to this day. A few years later, around the 1940s, Eugene Krabs and Sheldon Plankton, themselves the worst enemies of all, who were best friends at the time, opened the first fast food joint in Bikini Bottom, but they end up falling out after accidentally killing Old Man Jenkins with a tainted Krabby Patty, leading them to part ways and each open their own restaurant. Eugene manages to recreate the formula his ancestor had discovered in the Middle Ages. As we know, the Chum Bucket is a complete failure, while the Krusty Krab is such a massive success that young SpongeBob, still in his mother's womb in 1986, had his first encounter with the Krabby Patty when his parents went there for a meal. In other words, we could say that the first thing SpongeBob ever ate in his life was a Krabby Patty, which explains why he loves his job of making these burgers so much. At the same time that SpongeBob was discovering his calling as a burger cook, he befriended someone who would become his best friend for the rest of his life, Patrick Star, who was just 1 month younger than SpongeBob. Following the show's timeline, 4 years after SpongeBob's birth, in 1990, Pearl, Mr. Krabs' daughter, is born. How did that happen? I have no idea, but I honestly believe she might be an adopted child, don't you think? 5 years later, in the year 1995, Squidward starts working with Mr. Krabs at the Krusty Krab, becoming his longest-serving employee. Not that it means much considering he's only been around for 2. He even worked as Pearl's babysitter before that. The years go by, and SpongeBob grows up, deciding it's time to move out and find a place to live. He ends up living in a real pineapple that falls off a boat right next to Squidward, making it the perfect spot for SpongeBob to live, and, as a bonus, giving the grumpy mollusk 2 new neighbors, since Patrick also moves there and starts living under a rock. After having his own house, without even paying for it, SpongeBob decides he wants company and adopts Gary, who becomes his beloved pet for the rest of his life. With his house, a beloved pet, and cherished friends, there was only one thing missing in SpongeBob's life: a job. And that's where we arrive at the first episode of the show, when SpongeBob applies for his dream job, working at the Krusty Krab, as that had been his dream since he was a tiny fry, and he succeeds after obtaining the super modern spatula. Sometime later, all the way from Texas, Sandy Cheeks arrives in Bikini Bottom, the last of the main characters to join the show, the only permanent mammal resident of the underwater city. This marks the beginning of a beautiful friendship, which, whether you believe it or not, eventually leads to something even more: marriage. But before you get too excited, I have to tell you that even though the wedding happened, it was all just a play and a performance where SpongeBob and Sandy were just acting. But that doesn't mean it can't happen one day, right? Moving forward in the series, we see SpongeBob attempting to get his driver's license, getting his milkshake license, and making colorful burgers. But then comes the day when King Neptune is convinced to celebrate his 5,000th birthday at the Krusty Krab itself. However, he becomes upset upon seeing a sign with his son's name on it. Remember, he had locked him up a long time ago. SpongeBob and Patrick go to the island to free the young Neptune, who is furious with his father. After being released, he goes to Bikini Bottom to take revenge on him, inadvertently destroying the whole town. This fulfills his father's initial desire for him to become strong and respected through fear, leading to their reconciliation. Now, fast-forwarding to the future, we see SpongeBob 75 years later, still living in his pineapple amidst modern skyscrapers and still being neighbors with Squidward. And we come back to the episode where Squidward travels through time, but he ends up freezing and is only discovered 2,000 years later, as indicated by the calendar showing the year 4077. There he meets the future's Espongatron, where there are multiple clones of SpongeBob and everything is chromed. And the last glimpse of the future in SpongeBob is of an alien civilization 3,000 years ahead, trying to decipher who created all those SpongeBob sculptures. It turns out SpongeBob himself made them in a cave, but they don't know that. They only understand it as the work of an ancient civilization. And that's the story of SpongeBob from beginning to end. Who would have thought this cartoon would have such a lengthy chronology, right? Drop a comment below if you're also a SpongeBob fan. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on the upcoming videos. Until next time, bye-bye!